Luma and the Atelier of Evening Perfumes. Luma arrived at the edge of a quiet neighborhood at the hour when lamps begin to bloom and the streets trade their daytime voices for a soft murmur, and there she found a doorway painted the color of dusk with a bell that chimed like a silver drop of rain whenever the door opened, and above it a sign in careful script said Atelier of Evening Perfumes, promising a world where scent could behave like gentle weather and where breath could learn a slower pace. Inside, the room unfolded as a calm laboratory of comfort, walls lined with shelves of dark glass and pale glass, each bottle carrying a name that sounded like a poem: meadow linen, rain on old stone, almond light, cedar hush, jasmine after the first cool wind, and the air was warm with the quiet presence of copper stills whose round bellies reflected every lamp as a small moon, while coils of glass wound like friendly rivers toward resting bowls of water that offered themselves to carry the newest distillations. The perfumer, a soft-spoken woman with sleeves rolled just enough to reveal wrists steady as metronomes, greeted Luma with a nod that did not interrupt the tranquil music of the room, a music made of faint drips, slow bubbling, and the delicate sigh that bottles make when uncorked, and she said, "Welcome, small traveler, choose a seat wherever your breath wishes to sit, and perhaps the atelier will choose a path for you tonight." Luma placed her paws upon a wooden stool whose grain shone with attentive care, and from that height she could watch the steady dance of steam inside the glass necks, could see the way tiny droplets gathered like patient thoughts and then released themselves to fall into the waiting bowls, and she understood that the entire room was practicing the art of arriving without hurry. On a long table rested trays of petals and seeds and resins sleeping in small dishes, vanilla dark as a friendly night, orris as pale as early fog, cardamom pods shaped like little boats, a sprig of lavender arranged like a memory of a hillside in late summer, and beside the trays lay envelopes of paper for blotters, soft as breath, ready to carry a trail of scent to whoever wished to listen with the nose. The perfumer introduced Luma to the ritual of the quiet inhalation, a practice the atelier offered to all who entered. Inhale kindly for 4 heart counts, hold the softness for 2, exhale for 6, rest for 2, repeat until the shoulders agree to be lower, and while they practiced together the stills continued their measured work, a reminder that patience wears beautiful colors when seen through warm glass. When Luma had found a comfortable rhythm, the perfumer placed before her 3 tiny bottles with handwritten labels: morning leaf, linen light, first rain on cobblestone, and invited her to smell them one by one, to let each note introduce itself without competition, and to notice where the breath wished to linger. Morning leaf opened like a window toward a garden, with a tender greenness that seemed to remember dew on citrus skin and the snap of a clean stem, and as Luma inhaled she felt the air in the atelier turn quietly toward the same garden, as though the room enjoyed the memory too. Linen light remembered the warmth of sheets that have traveled from a line in calm air to a bed that welcomes them, a cotton brightness softened by sun, and it carried a whisper of almond that made the edges of the room smoother, the corners rounder, the silence warmer. First rain on cobblestone woke the perfume of stone that has waited politely all day and now lifts a soft voice when the first drops arrive, and there was a secret toast of tea leaves hidden inside, as if the rain had passed a window where a kettle spoke to itself. The perfumer smiled and said, "The atelier likes how your breath listens," and she brought forth a shallow drawer filled with vials in a rainbow only scent can see, and from among them she chose a dropper of bergamot that suggested light without glare, a bottle of neroli that walked as gracefully as a kind memory, a whisper of clary sage that greeted the mind the way a friend greets you at a gate, and a smoother note of almond milk that promised to soften any sharpness into velvet. They began to compose a gently breathing accord, placing a single drop on a blotter, then a second drop upon another, bringing them together under Luma's nose and asking the air to do its quiet blending, and with each trial the perfumer recorded the tiny steps in a book whose pages smelled of cedar pencil and distant spice, and Luma watched the numbers and words flow like a river that knows every stone by name. As time settled deeper into the room, the perfumer invited Luma into the back conservatory where the atelier kept living notes, small citrus trees wearing shy blossoms, pots of mint and lemon balm, a rosemary bush that looked as scented as a monk, and a night-blooming vine that preferred to hold its fragrance until the lamps grew thoughtful. The conservatory roof wore a steady film of condensation that gathered into slow tears and slid downward in clear paths, a soft map of patience. They wandered among the pots, and the perfumer showed how a leaf releases different stories depending on where it is touched, that a gentle stroke from stem to tip asks for one song and from tip to stem asks for another, and Luma listened as if reading with her paws, amazed by the generosity of small plants that offered music to anyone who approached with care. A small cat who served as the atelier's evening attendant appeared from behind a rack of drying peels, stretching in the unhurried manner of those who understand the measurement of comfort, and the cat's bell collar made a sound like a single raindrop finding a copper bowl, after which the cat sat beside Luma as if they had been friends for years and would be again in another life. The perfumer poured warm water into a glass basin and added 3 petals and 1 drop of almond light, inviting Luma to place her paws upon the rim and lean over the steam, and the steam rose as a soft scarf to cover her muzzle and her eyes, a clear fabric that taught her breath the polite gates where it could pass, and when she exhaled the steam accepted her warmth and folded it into its own, a small exchange of kindness. The atelier lamps dimmed to a late glow, and the perfumer said this house keeps a ritual called the stroll of gentle names, in which the ingredients introduce themselves to the evening with their softest titles, so that none must be allowed to be known, and she invited Luma to walk the shelves while she whispered those names into the air: oak moss as a quiet path under old trees, coumarin as a meadow that remembers hay, tonka as a vanilla that once read a book of rain, musk as a skin that has learned sunlight, sandalwood as a floor built by patient hands, bergamot as a bright curtain that does not blind, neroli as a blossom that remembers orange groves and lullabies, cedar as a pencil sketch of a forest at noon. Luma felt the names gather like a string of friendly beads, and as the stroll ended, the perfumer asked if she might like to blend a small personal perfume to carry through the night, not a scent of display but a pocket of rest, and Luma nodded with joyful calm. The composition began with a gentle top that would lift the first inhale without startling it, a ribbon of bergamot dressed with the tender leafiness she had liked, and then a heart of neroli touched by jasmine tea, and beneath that a base that promised a long field of quiet, smooth sandalwood, a cradle of almond milk, a breath of musk like the memory of a nearby blanket, and a trace of cedar that could help thoughts remember their way to stillness. They worked by drops and pauses, each pause given as much attention as each drop, and the perfumer repeated the breathing practice at small intervals, so the composition could learn the timing of rest, and with each inhale Luma felt edges soften, with each exhale the room seemed to agree with her shoulders. When the blend felt ready to test upon skin, the perfumer dabbed a tiny dot upon the inside of Luma's foreleg, and they waited, listening as the notes arranged themselves more comfortably, like guests finding chairs in a circle and sitting with the right distance between them. And Luma sensed how the heart notes rose like warm tea while the bass stretched like a patient quilt. They returned to the front room where a large wooden clock existed only to keep quiet heartbeats for the glass and copper, and the perfumer prepared a small flask for Luma, rinsed 3 times with steam so it would receive the perfume like a grateful room, and Luma watched the final blend pour in a thin thread of light, watched the thread curl upon itself like silk in slow water, and felt a calm satisfaction place its hand on her back. To celebrate the blend, the perfumer set a tiny kettle upon a low flame and dropped in a segment of candied citrus peel, and soon the air wore a sweeter scarf that mingled with the new perfume in a conversation as easy as friends leaning against a railing at dusk, remarking on nothing and everything in equal measure. The cat led Luma to a window seat where cushions waited like thoughtful clouds, and there the perfumer brought a small notebook with thick paper, suggesting that some visitors enjoy writing a single sentence to leave with the room, and Luma wrote, "I will breathe kindly so that my thoughts may also breathe kindly," and the ink dried as quickly as rain absorbed by warm earth. Outside the night deepened without urgency, and the atelier opened its back door to a courtyard where a fountain kept a quiet circle of reflection, the water moving so slowly it seemed to think more than flow, and their candles floated in little glass cups sending small warm moons across the surface. The perfumer explained that every evening at this hour the staff carries 3 bowls to the fountain, one filled with petals used in the day's work, one with clean water, and one with quiet promises written on paper, and that the bowls are emptied in a specific order meant to honor the services of the day, first the petals to return beauty to water, then the water to refresh the pool, then the papers to rest inside the herb beds where promises like to root. Luma assisted by nudging one paper gently into the soil beside a sprig of lemon balm, and the paper accepted the embrace of earth with a grateful curl, and the lemon balm answered with a breath of brightness that lifted and then folded back into the dark like a polite wave. Inside again, the perfumer offered Luma a simple practice to use whenever rest seemed difficult, Open the bottle, hold it near but not upon the nose, inhale once for the top, once for the heart, once for the base, then close the bottle and let the memory do the rest. And Luma repeated the motions slowly until they felt as natural as tapping a door before entering a friend's room. She lingered a while longer to watch the copper stills complete their last conversations with the night, each final drip like a gentle punctuation mark at the end of a paragraph that had been written all day by steam and patience, and the perfumer turned down the lamps until their light rested like fruit at the edge of sleep. Before Luma left, the perfumer tied a thin ribbon around the small flask, a ribbon dyed with tea to the color of warm linen, and attached a card that read "Evening Accord for Kindly Breathing," a title that made Luma's heart feel carefully held, and she tucked the flask into a pocket of her scarf. The bell on the dusk-colored door chimed once more as Luma stepped into the cool night, and the street welcomed her with its own perfumes, stone that had released the day's warmth, leaves that had given up their last light, a distant bakery that thought about morning bread even now, and she walked slowly with the flask close to her heart, practicing the 3 breaths she had learned. She reached a small park bordered by laurels and sat upon a bench shaped like a long smooth pebble, and the bench seemed to appreciate her company, warming slightly where her paws rested, and she unscrewed the cap of the flask and allowed a hint of the accord to rise and find her face. The top greeted her again with its bright invitation, the heart held her as if wrapping her in a shawl, and the base promised to stay awake for her dreams, to watch the door while she slept, and in gratitude she closed the flask and watched the trees draw the night over themselves, like familiar blankets. A gentle breeze moved through leaves with a sound like sighs shared between friends, and somewhere a bicycle bell rang once and then nothing followed it, which seemed to Luma the perfect way for a bell to speak at this hour, and she let her breathing fall into the simple music of the park. When the time felt right, she returned to the atelier's doorway and slipped a second card beneath it, a thank you written with the same careful script she had seen earlier, not with words but with the feeling of a fox tucking her head beneath her tail at the edge of sleep. At last she walked home along a path that had learned all the good manners of quiet streets, the stones offering soft reflections of lamps, the windows closing slowly like eyelids, and at each corner she paused to breathe, knowing that she could carry the atelier wherever her lungs were willing to remember. In her room she placed the flask upon the sill and left the window slightly open so that the night could lean inside and keep her company, and she lay down upon her blanket with her paws tucked beneath her and her ears set to the lower volume of rest, and before closing her eyes she whispered the names she had learned, a rosary of softness that threaded the space between her thoughts with light. Sleep arrived as a companion rather than a command, stepping quietly over the threshold, laying a shawl of almond and sandalwood across her shoulders, ushering neroli to sit near her heart, asking bergamot to hold a lantern at the far end of the room for a little while, then letting that lantern dim in its own sweet time until only memory remained, which was enough. The night stretched in a ribbon of gentle minutes, and Luma felt curious to see what rested behind a curtain of linen at the back of the shop, and with a nod from the perfumer she slipped through and entered the archive room where shelves held notebooks bound in cloth, each spine labeled with dates and little titles that sounded like the beginnings of lullabies: Blue Evening on Tile, Cedar Window After Small Rain, Quiet Procession of Umbrellas, and when she opened one book the pages released a ghost of heliotrope and pencil, a dry floral calm that made her feel as if she had just pushed open a window upon a quiet courtyard. Beside the notebook stood a cabinet of old glass that kept macerations sleeping in amber bottles, peels resting in clear spirit, roots resting in calm darkness, vanilla beans granting their kindness to liquid that would one day learn to glow, and each bottle looked outward the way a cat watches a room, patient and sure about the shape of waiting. On a trolley near the window lay a map of the city drawn not with lines but with perfumes, dots of scent arranged to mark places where a fragrance had first been dreamed, a train platform that smelled of steel and warm bread, a courtyard where linden trees remember how to harmonize with swallows, a bookshop that keeps cedar dust in its spine, and Luma traced these dots with a paw as if planning a gentle walk she might take in the morning. The perfumer joined her there and told a story in a whisper about a traveler who once arrived with pockets full of leaves from many coasts and asked the atelier to teach those leaves how to speak together, and how the blend that resulted smelled like a conversation in which no voice needed to be louder than another, a round table of scents smiling quietly at one another until the whole room felt like friendship. A soft tapping began at the window, the first hints of a new sprinkle carried by a breeze that had learned patience, and they watched the drops form tiny round worlds upon the glass before sliding away, and the atelier answered by warming just slightly, as though the room were a host drawing an extra blanket over the shoulders of its guests. The cat suggested, with the polite insistence of a tail flick, that it was time to tour the drawer of accords, a drawer divided like a box of watercolor pans, each square holding a miniature universe, clean sheets on a line in slow wind, tea at a table under a tree, early bakery at the edge of dawn, and Luma sniffed each square and learned how even the memory of warmth can be warm enough to rest inside. When she returned to the main table, the perfumer placed a second blotter beside the first and asked her to compare the opening now that a quarter hour had passed, and Luma noticed how the bright top had softened into something round, how the heart had unfolded like a small book of silk, how the base had steadied into a floor that carried her weight gladly. She wrote this in the notebook they had begun together, a notebook that from now on would wait for her visits, and she drew a line to mark the breath pattern that pleased the accord most, a simple rhythm that would be easy to remember when the world felt busy, and she smiled at how a scent could learn to breathe with a person just as a person could learn to breathe with a scent. At a workbench by the door a parcel station waited with soft paper and twine, with little wax seals in the shape of leaves and moons and small cups, and the perfumer showed how to wrap the flask without making corners sharp, turning the paper so it hugged the bottle the way a gentle hand hugs a wrist, and when the seal touched the fold it made the faintest kiss of sound. From the ceiling hung a set of chimes tuned so low they could only be heard by a patient ear, and each time the door breathed or a kettle sighed, the chimes offered a note that felt like the inside of a seashell, and the note lingered in the room after its sound had left, a kind of remembered music. Luma asked about the copper stills, and the perfumer explained how water and plants share a conversation inside, how warmth lifts what is ready to travel, and how coolness receives what is ready to return, and how the coils exist to give that journey an elegant path. And while she listened, Luma felt as though the still were teaching her the same lesson: rise gently when called, return kindly when ready, accept the shape of the path with gratitude. In a corner stood a chair made of bent wood that had been placed there on the first day the shop opened, a chair that had listened to countless stories and sighs, and the perfumer encouraged Luma to sit and let the chair remember her for a moment, and when she did, the wood made a tiny settling sound that felt like a welcome spoken by an old friend. The evening unscrolled, and at last they prepared to close. Luma held the flask and understood that she carried not only a scent but a map, a way to find this room again wherever breath was available, and she also carried the knowledge that the room would hold her place in its memory as surely as a bookmark holds a page.